You're standing on a dusty road in the Balkans, summer of 1014. The heat sits on your skin like a weight. The air smells wrong sweat, rot, and the sour stink of bodies that haven't been washed in days. In the distance, you hear something moving toward you. Not drums, not horns, not victory songs, just moaning, thousands of voices, low and broken, like a single animal dying slowly. And then the sound becomes a shape, an army. 15,000 men, except they're not marching, they're stumbling, shuffling forward in a grotesque parade, each step uncertain, each shoulder crashing into the next. Their faces are streaked with dried blood. Their eye sockets are empty or crusted over, as if the road itself scraped the sight out of them. You don't need anyone to explain what you're seeing. Your body understands before your mind does. Every 100 men move as one unit. 99 of them are completely blind, and at the front of each group is the 100th man left with one eye. One eye, not mercy, not chance, design, because a column of blind soldiers can't walk home by itself. Someone has to lead them. Someone has to see the horror in full detail, the ruined faces, the faltering hands reaching for a shoulder, the panic when the line breaks and the blind fall into ditches or slam into stones. That one-eyed guide is forced to witness everything he's guiding back to his king. He becomes a living courier, a message that breathes. This is psychological warfare perfected. Not just a victory, but a performance. Not just revenge, but revenge elevated into art. Two emperors hate each other so deeply that the battlefield stops being a place to win and becomes a stage to humiliate. The punishment isn't aimed at the soldiers alone. It's aimed at the mind of the man waiting at the end of the road. And here's the truly horrifying part. When this procession finally reaches their king, the sight doesn't just break him, it kills him. He takes one look at what has been done to his men, and 2 days later he's dead. Shock, they say. Grief, they say. But the truth is simpler. The weapon worked. This is not myth. This is not exaggeration for drama. This is history cold, deliberate, calculated. And the question you should be asking isn't, how could anyone do this? The question is, what kind of hatred burns so long, so patiently, that blinding an army feels like justice? Because to understand what you're about to hear next, you need to understand one thing. This didn't happen in a moment of rage. It happened after years of waiting. But how do you reach a point like this? What kind of hatred burns long enough, deep enough, that blinding 15,000 men can be framed as justice rather than madness? To answer that, we have to rewind not days, not months, but decades back into a world where cruelty was not an accident of war, but a tool refined by empire. This is not just a battlefield story. It is the story of how power thinks when it believes itself eternal. We are in the early 11th century, standing at the edge of what we now call the medieval period. But the people living in this world would not have recognized that label, especially not the Byzantines, because to them, this was not a medieval kingdom limping along after Rome's collapse. This was Rome. The Byzantine Empire saw itself as the direct continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, the last legitimate heir to imperial authority on earth. In their worldview, history had not ended. It had narrowed, and Constantinople stood at its center. The city was unlike anything else in the Christian world. Vast, wealthy, layered with marble and bureaucracy. It housed libraries, universities, and an administrative machine so advanced that it would outclass much of Europe for centuries. While Western Europe remained fractured and feudal, Byzantium commanded Greek fire, advanced engineering, a professional standing army, and a state capable of sustaining long, grinding wars. But empires like this share one trait above all others. They cannot tolerate limits. They are always hungry. And in this period, the Byzantine Empire faced a problem it could not ignore. Bulgaria. The First Bulgarian Empire had not only survived on Byzantium's northern frontier, it had grown strong there. For decades, Bulgaria resisted Byzantine expansion, pushing back, holding territory, and slowly carving out power across the Balkans. Its lands stretched from the Danube River down toward the Aegean Sea, from the Adriatic coast to the Black Sea. This was no barbarian fringe state. Bulgaria had its own church, its own administration, its own political identity. And worst of all, from the Byzantine perspective, it had independence. That was the real crime. In a world where Byzantium believed there could be only one legitimate empire, Bulgarian sovereignty was not a political disagreement. It was an act of rebellion against the natural order, against God's order. And rebellions, in imperial logic, are not negotiated with. They are corrected. This is the world that produced Basil II. And this is the pressure that would turn rivalry into obsession, and obsession into something far darker. To understand why this war could only end in catastrophe, you need to understand how the Byzantine Empire understood the world itself. Because in Byzantine thinking, conflict was not just political, it was existential. At the heart of Byzantine ideology was a concept called oikumene, the civilized Christian world under legitimate authority. And here is the crucial point. Legitimacy was not shared. It was exclusive. There could be only one rightful emperor, one true heir to Rome, one divinely sanctioned ruler of the Christian world. Everyone else existed in a temporary state of error. In this worldview, borders were not negotiated. They were corrected. So when the Byzantine court looked north and saw Bulgaria, they did not see a neighboring kingdom. They saw a contradiction, a rebellion against the natural order, a political heresy. Bulgaria's independence was not merely inconvenient, it was intolerable. And Tsar Samuel stood at the center of that defiance. To the Byzantines, Samuel was not a king in his own right. He was a pretender occupying land that rightfully belonged to Rome. A man who refused to accept reality, someone who had to be brought to heel. One way or another. That belief alone guaranteed that peace was impossible, but ideology alone does not explain the scale of what followed. For that, you have to look at the men. On one side stood Basil II, Emperor of the Romans, a ruler shaped by insecurity, discipline, and memory. Raised amid palace intrigue and betrayal, Basil learned early that weakness invited destruction. By the time he ruled alone, he had stripped his life down to one purpose: the survival and expansion of the empire. He did not forgive. He did not forget. Injuries, especially public ones, lodged deep. Across the mountains stood Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria, a very different kind of ruler. His rise came from chaos, not inheritance. Through relentless campaigning and tactical brilliance, he turned Bulgaria into a resilient power. He did not seek glory. He sought survival. And most importantly, he understood that Bulgaria could never defeat Byzantium on its terms. So Samuel chose terrain over tradition, ambush over spectacle, patience over pride. Every time Samuel resisted, every time he denied Basil a clean victory, he wasn't just winning battles. He was undermining an entire worldview. He was proving publicly that the empire was not inevitable. That was the real offense. What began as imperial doctrine hardened into something far more dangerous: obsession. Two men, shaped by completely different worlds, locked into a struggle where compromise meant erasure. And once a conflict reaches that point, it can no longer end quietly. It can only end with someone broken. In the summer of 986, the war crossed a line. Until that moment, Bulgaria was a problem to be managed, a border to be secured, a rebellion to be corrected. But that summer, Tsar Samuel decided it would become something else, something that would burn for decades. The year is 986. Basil II is still young, not yet the hardened ruler history would later fear. He's in his late 20s, confident, freshly tested. He has already crushed internal revolts. He has proven that he belongs on the throne. And now, he believes the Bulgarian question can be solved once and for all. So he gathers an army. Sources suggest around 30,000 men, an enormous force for the period. even if medieval numbers tend to exaggerate. What matters is the intent behind it. This is not a probing campaign. This is a statement. Basil marches into Bulgaria with the certainty of an emperor who believes history is on his side. His objective is Serdica, modern-day Sofia, a strategic fortress. Take it, and the heart of Bulgaria opens. On paper, the campaign looks inevitable. The Byzantines have better equipment, professional troops, superior organization. This should be quick, but Samuel has been waiting. After inconclusive fighting around Serdica, Basil makes a decision that seems perfectly reasonable. Winter is approaching. August heat has exhausted men and animals alike. He orders a withdrawal, regroup, resupply. Return in spring. A rational choice, a fatal one. To return to Byzantine territory, Basil's army must pass through a narrow mountain corridor known as Trajan's Gate, deep in the Sredna Gora Mountains, a tight valley where formations collapse, where visibility disappears, where numbers stop mattering. Samuel knew this route. He had prepared for it. He allowed the Byzantine army to march in unchallenged. No early attack, no warning, just silence. The entire column stretches through the pass tired, compressed, unable to maneuver. Then Samuel strikes. Bulgarian forces pour down from the heights. The Byzantine soldiers, elite as they are, cannot form proper battle lines in the confined terrain. Orders are lost. Units break. Panic spreads faster than steel. The sources try to soften what follows. They fail. It is a massacre. The emperor's bodyguard fights desperately to save Basil. According to the chroniclers, he barely escapes. He abandons his army, mounts a fast horse, and flees back toward Constantinople. Behind him, everything is lost. The Bulgarians seize the imperial treasury. Weapons, armor, supplies. But the most valuable thing they take cannot be carried. They take Basil's dignity. For a man who believed himself chosen by God, destined to rule the Christian world, this was not merely defeat. It was humiliation, personal, public, spiritual, and Basil II would never forget it. This was the moment the war stopped being strategic and became inevitable. To understand what came next, you have to understand how emperors, especially Byzantine emperors, experienced defeat. This was not like a modern general losing a battle, writing reports, and adjusting strategy. In the Byzantine worldview, the emperor was not just a political leader, he was the visible instrument of divine order. His victories confirmed God's will, his defeats threatened it. To Basil II, Trajan's Gate was not a setback, it was a cosmic insult. Samuel had not merely beaten him, he had exposed him. He had proven, in front of soldiers and subjects alike, that the man who claimed to be Rome's rightful emperor could bleed, flee, and fail. That kind of humiliation does not fade. It festers. And Basil II was not a man who forgot injuries. After Trajan's Gate, Basil changed. The confident, impulsive young emperor hardened into something colder, more controlled, more dangerous. There was no dramatic counterattack, no reckless revenge. That would have been emotional, and Basil was done being emotional. Instead, he turned inward. The defeat had consequences. Generals who had watched their emperor escape disaster began to whisper. Some believed they could rule better. Others saw weakness. Rebellions followed, not from enemies abroad, but from within the empire itself. Basil crushed them all, one by one, methodically, with no hesitation and no mercy. Each revolt taught him discipline, patience, the value of timing over speed. By the time he finished, the Byzantine state belonged to him completely. No rivals, no challengers, no doubt. And through all of it, Bulgaria never left his mind. Starting in the late 982s and continuing through the 992s, Basil began what would become the central project of his reign, the systematic destruction of the Bulgarian state. Not conquest, erasure. This was not a war of heroic battles or decisive clashes. Basil avoided Samuel's army whenever possible. He did not seek glory. He sought exhaustion. Every year, every single year, Byzantine forces marched into Bulgarian territory. They burned crops, destroyed farmland, captured and dismantled fortresses. Then they withdrew. No occupation, no peace talks. Next year, the same thing again. The Byzantine historian John Skylitzes describes it with chilling simplicity. The Emperor Basil II continued to invade Bulgaria each year and destroy and devastate everything on his way. Think about the effect on ordinary people. Every summer brought terror. Farmers abandoned fields. Villages hid supplies. Even if the army bypassed your town, someone else's harvest burned, which meant hunger for everyone when winter came. Samuel fought back fiercely. He inflicted real losses. In 998, he even invaded Byzantine territory, reaching Thessaloniki itself. But the math never changed. Byzantium could absorb losses and continue. Bulgaria could not. By the early 11th century, fortresses began to fall. Nobles defected. The state started to collapse, not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, predictably, and without mercy. This was not revenge in a single strike. It was revenge stretched across decades. And Basil II was patient enough to wait. By the early years of the 11th century, Tsar Samuel was an old man, probably in his 60s, an advanced age for a medieval ruler who had spent most of his life on campaign. Decades of war had carved deep lines into both his face and his kingdom. Fortresses were falling. Allies were defecting. The empire he had built through sheer will was collapsing inch by inch, and Samuel knew it. This was not ignorance. This was awareness. Bulgaria was being strangled slowly, deliberately, by an enemy that never tired. Every year, the Byzantines returned. Every year, more land was burned, more resources lost, more loyalty shaken. Samuel could still fight, but he could no longer endure. And that realization is dangerous. History shows us that desperate men rarely choose safe options. They choose bold ones, risky ones, sometimes catastrophic ones. In 1014, as Basil II prepared for yet another campaign season, Samuel made his decision. He could not win a war of attrition. He could not outlast the resources, manpower, and patience of the Byzantine Empire. If this continued, Bulgaria would simply cease to exist. So Samuel gambled everything on one moment. If he could not survive, then he would strike once. One battle, one decisive confrontation that might shatter Basil's confidence, disrupt the rhythm of Byzantine dominance, and force a reassessment. It was not a plan built on certainty. It was built on necessity. Samuel began searching for terrain that could give him what numbers no longer could, and he found it. A narrow mountain valley known as the Clydian Pass. By July 1014, Basil II was marching deep into Bulgarian territory with a large, disciplined force. Samuel understood that this might be his final chance to change the course of the war. He studied the terrain obsessively, because here, geography itself offered a weapon. The Clydian Pass, its name meaning the key, in Greek was a narrow gorge wedged between the Belasitsa and Ograzdan mountains. This was a place where movement was restricted, where armies could not deploy properly, where numbers lost their advantage. In places like this, preparation mattered more than strength. Samuel ordered his engineers to act fast. Across the valley, they built a massive fortification, a wall of earth and timber that completely blocked the pass from mountain to mountain. Crude, but formidable. Behind it, Samuel positioned the best troops Bulgaria still had. Veterans. Survivors. Likely 12 to 15,000 men, the last real army of the Bulgarian Empire. The plan was brutally simple. Basil could not go around the mountains in any reasonable time. Supplies, terrain, and distance worked against him. If he wanted to continue his campaign, he would have to come through the pass. And when he did, Samuel intended to turn the geography that once humiliated Basil into the weapon that would save Bulgaria. This was not optimism. It was defiance. And it was the last stand of a dying empire. When Basil II's army reached the Clydian Pass and saw the fortification blocking the valley, there must have been a moment of silence. Recognition. This terrain was painfully familiar. 30 years earlier, at Trajan's Gate, Basil had watched his own army collapse in a narrow mountain pass just like this one. He had barely escaped with his life. That memory never left him. And now, here it was again, stone, timber, mountains pressing in, an enemy waiting above. But Basil was no longer the young emperor of 986. He was in his mid-50s now. Nearly 3 decades of constant warfare had stripped away hesitation. Where the younger Basil had rushed and failed, this one endured. He had learned to absorb losses without flinching, and when faced with resistance, his instinct was no longer retreat. He ordered the attack. Day after day, Byzantine troops hurled themselves against the Bulgarian wall. Sources differ on the exact length. Some say 3 days, others closer to a week, but they agree on the result. The assaults failed, repeatedly, brutally. The Bulgarians fought with the desperation of men who knew this was their last stand. From behind their fortifications, they rained arrows and javelins into the packed Byzantine ranks below. Rocks crashed down into shields and helmets. Boiling oil was poured on soldiers who reached the base of the wall. In the narrow confines of the pass, there was nowhere to spread out, nowhere to maneuver. Bodies began to pile up. The valley floor turned slick with blood and mud. Byzantine dead lay stacked in front of the fortification, silent proof that imperial power could still be stopped, at least for now. Inside the Byzantine camp, tension grew. This was not supposed to happen. The memory of Trajan's Gate loomed over every failed assault. Some of Basil's generals began to urge caution. Find another route, pull back, preserve the army before this turns into another disaster. But Basil did not panic, because while the attacks continued, he was thinking not about the wall in front of him, but about the mountains above it. He had been speaking quietly with one of his most capable commanders, Nikephoros Xiphias, and Xiphias had proposed something audacious, dangerous, almost unthinkable. What if they didn't go through the pass at all? What if they went over the mountain? The Belasica range was no gentle ridge. It was steep, forested wilderness, cut with ravines and cliffs. No roads, no supply lines. Moving troops through it would be slow, exhausting, and lethal if discovered. A single Bulgarian scout could doom the entire force. But if it worked, the war would end here. Basil weighed the risk. Then he gave the order. Nikephoros Xiphias was to take a detachment and disappear into the mountains. And with that decision, the battle at Kleidion stopped being a test of strength and became a test of nerve. Nikephoros Xiphias took his detachment and vanished into the mountains. We don't know the exact number, likely a few thousand men, but what matters is what they were asked to do. This was not a march. It was an ordeal. For days, they clawed their way through the Belasica range, moving through steep forests and rocky slopes where there were no roads, no maps, and no margin for error. They carried full equipment, armor, weapons, supplies. Every step burned energy they might desperately need later. Goat paths narrowed to ledges. Ravines opened suddenly beneath their feet. One slip could mean death not just for the man who fell, but for the mission itself. Silence was survival. Orders were whispered. Shields were padded to keep metal from striking stone. Fires were forbidden. If even one Bulgarian scout spotted them, the entire force could be trapped and destroyed in the mountains before Basil ever knew what happened. Below them, Basil played his part perfectly. The main Byzantine army continued its brutal frontal assaults on the Bulgarian wall. Day after day, the attacks came loud, bloody, predictable. To the Bulgarians, it looked like victory. They were exhausted, battered, but confident. They had held the pass. They had broken the empire's momentum. The wall still stood. By the morning of July 29th, 1014, Bulgarian defenders believed they were winning. That morning began like every other. Byzantine troops advanced toward the fortification. Shouts rose. Arrows flew. Men braced for impact. And then the sound came. Not from the front, from behind. At first, it made no sense. War cries, Byzantine war cries cutting through the air from the direction that was supposed to be safe. For a heartbeat, confusion froze the Bulgarian lines, then panic rippled outward like a crack through glass. Nike Foros, Shifias, had made it. His force emerged from the mountains directly behind the Bulgarian army. Dust-covered, exhausted, and very real. According to the Byzantine historian John Skylitzes, the Bulgarian defense collapsed almost immediately. This was not an orderly retreat. It was a psychological rupture. Men abandoned the wall. Units broke apart. Soldiers turned and ran, not knowing where to flee. And this is where the trap closed. The Bulgarians had built a massive wall across the valley to keep the Byzantines out. Now it boxed them in. With Xiphias's men attacking from the rear and Basil's main army surging forward, there was nowhere to go. The pass became a slaughterhouse. Bodies piled up between timber and steel. Men were cut down as they tried to climb their own fortifications. Others were crushed in the chaos. Discipline dissolved into terror. Tsar Samuel himself barely escaped. Sources say his son, Gabriel Radomir, fought through Byzantine soldiers and dragged his father onto a horse. They fled the field, while behind them, the last real Bulgarian army was being annihilated. By midday, the battle was over. But for the thousands who survived and surrendered, the nightmare was only beginning. The battle did not end cleanly. It unraveled. What began as a collapse turned into a rout, and the rout hardened into massacre. Thousands of Bulgarian soldiers were cut down as they tried to flee the narrow valley. Others threw away their weapons, dropped their shields, and surrendered. By the end of the day, the field was silent except for the wounded and the living who were now prisoners. Byzantine sources claim as many as 15,000 Bulgarians were captured alive. The exact number is debated, but the scale is not. These men were disarmed, stripped of their armor, and herded together under guard. The fighting was over. The war, for all practical purposes, was decided. But the prisoners did not know that the worst part of the story had not yet happened, because Emperor Basil II was standing on that battlefield, looking at the broken remnants of the army that had humiliated him nearly 3 decades earlier. He was thinking about Trajan's Gate, about the day he fled through the mountains, abandoning his men, about the shame that had followed him for 28 years. And Basil did not forget injuries. What followed was not rage. It was calculation. Basil had options. He could have ransomed the prisoners, a common practice that would have filled the imperial treasury. He could have executed them brutal, but expected. He could have enslaved them or absorbed them into the machinery of empire. He chose none of these. Instead, Basil gave an order that must have sounded incomprehensible when it was first spoken. The prisoners were divided into groups of 100. Then Byzantine soldiers began the systematic blinding of 99 men in each group. Not killed, not maimed at random, blinded, deliberately, methodically, permanently. The 100th man was spared one eye. Someone had to lead the others home. This was not mercy. It was design. Blinding was not unknown in Byzantine politics. It was used on rivals to the throne because a physically imperfect man could not rule. But Basil weaponized it on an unprecedented scale. He transformed a political tool into an instrument of mass terror. Thousands of blind men were formed into columns, empty eye sockets crusted with blood, hands gripping shoulders. Each group guided by a one-eyed man forced to see everything, to watch friends stumble, fall, scream, and grope forward in darkness. They were not being sent home. They were being sent as a message. When this procession finally reached Tsar Samuel, the effect was devastating. The chronicles say the old king collapsed when he saw them. An army returned not defeated, but ruined, living evidence of total annihilation. Samuel fainted on the spot. 2 days later, he was dead. Basil's weapon had worked. He had not merely destroyed an army, he had killed a king without touching him, and that is why history remembers him by the name that followed, Basil the Bulgar Slayer. If you found this story thought-provoking, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. History is not only about what happened, but why it mattered. Follow for more stories that explore power, fear, and the human mind.